Hello, my front-end friend, and welcome to my podcast, General Musings. My name is Kevin, and in this podcast, I talk about whatever is front of mind for me in any given week, usually in some way that's related to front-end development. And a few weeks ago, I mentioned that it was as I was kicking things back up after the summer break that I took, that I was planning to have some more guests on, and this week is the first one of those guest appearances where I'm going to be having a conversation with Sara Soueidan. For those of you who don't know Sara, she is a UI engineer / front-end developer who's worked with companies all over the world, and she now primarily focuses on helping front-end developers elevate their craft and do what they do even better. Her expertise centers on the web standards, HTML, CSS, and SVG, and I've learned a ton of SVG stuff from Sara over the years, and these days she has a particular emphasis on writing accessible code. Now, since 2014, she's been sharing all of this knowledge of hers through speaking engagements and workshops, but she's also more recently created a comprehensive accessibility course called Practical Accessibility, which she has designed to make web accessibility more approachable for front-end designers and developers. And accessibility is going to be a big part of what we're talking about today, talking about why it's important and how developers can learn more about it. And we're also going to talk about some other stuff as well, going into CSS, course creation, and we're even going to meander our way into making homemade mayonnaise, as well as some other topics along the way there. And yeah, without further delay, let's jump right into it. So Sara, I just want to say thank you so much for your time and coming to join me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Now, before we dive into the weeds of everything, because there's quite a lot that I want to ask you about, I think it's just important that we define what accessibility on the web means, because I think for anybody who's listening that might have heard it, but they don't quite know exactly what we're talking about.
So web accessibility refers to making websites and web applications accessible to people with disabilities. It is essentially about removing barriers to access or making sure that you don't create barriers to access so that people with disabilities can access the web, can understand it, can operate it using any kind of assistive technology that they're using. Web accessibility, well, that's the official answer. I usually go on and talk about the difference between accessibility and inclusive design and usability. Should I go ahead and do?
Yeah, that would be great. I'm curious now what the differences are, so definitely.
Okay, so web accessibility targets issues that are specifically related to accessibility. But accessibility and inclusive design, or web accessibility and inclusive design on the web, these two terms, accessible and inclusive, are usually used interchangeably, but they do mean different things. And usually when I'm teaching about accessibility, one of the first things that I do is I make it clear the difference between accessibility, inclusivity, and usability. Because one of the most common phrases you will hear accessibility professionals say is, just because it conforms to WCAG, i.e. it's supposed to be accessible, does not guarantee that it's going to be usable. So there's a difference between something being accessible and being usable. Inclusive design, I'm going to read this the definition here. Inclusive design is about encapsulating a wide range of people from various backgrounds and ages and abilities and disabilities, genders, geographical locations, computer literacy, languages, and so on and so forth. It addresses diverse issues so that all users are involved to the greatest extent possible. Inclusive design encompasses accessibility because it targets all people. That includes people with disabilities. So it encompasses accessibility, and accessibility is therefore a natural outcome of effective inclusive design. You could also say that it's not inclusive. If it's not accessible, it's not inclusive. Accessible is subset of inclusive. Now, the difference between, let me just give a couple of examples. Is an inclusive design effort. It does not specifically target people with disabilities, but it targets all people everywhere who speak different languages. We have also web performance. Web performance is an inclusive design effort to make sure that everyone can access the web, whether they are using low-end devices or a slow connection. Like most of the times I'm on a fairly slow connection compared to others. So these are inclusive design efforts. They are not specific about accessibility, but accessibility is part of inclusive design. Now, an inclusive designer is proactive in pursuing inclusion of everyone as much as possible, regardless of their ability or disability. And an accessibility designer, on the other hand, focuses primarily on the needs of people with disabilities. Okay, that's the main difference. So in terms of the difference between accessibility and usability, I'm going to reference the official definition of usability from the International Standards Organization, or the ISO. It defines usability as the extent to which a product can be used by specified users to achieve specified goals effectively, efficiently, and with satisfaction in a specified context of use. right? I'm going to repeat that. The extent to which a product can be used by specified users to achieve specified goals effectively, efficiently, and with satisfaction in a specified context of use. So in other words, usability design should support diverse users in their diverse contexts to accomplish their tasks with effectiveness. Now, usability practice and research may not be specific about people with disabilities, but if you narrow down the definition of usability, so it says, the extent to which a product can be used by specified users. If you narrow that definition down to specified users being people with disabilities, to achieve specified goals efficiently, effectively, with satisfaction in a specified context of use. If you replace context of use with someone using an assistive technology, then you will also see that usability encompasses accessible design. But something being accessible does not guarantee that it's going to be usable. It's not going to be usable if it's not accessible. This should be clear.
Yes.
But something being accessible does not guarantee that it's going to be usable. And I have some examples of that.
Yeah, I'm curious actually now that you said that. I was like trying to, it feels like it should be something that works either way.
Well, because accessibility, I like to think of it as subsets. So accessibility is a subset of inclusive design. Inclusive design is a subset of usability. So what you want to aim for in general is to make sure that something is usable. That's going to guarantee that you have all inclusive design principles covered and that it's going to be accessible. Now, when we're talking about accessibility, how do you usually go about building an accessible product? What is what I call it the North Star of accessibility? Say you're just getting started with accessibility and you want to check if a website is accessible, or you want to start building something accessible. Usually you're going to go to check the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. You can conform to WCAG, but still create an unusable experience. Because WCAG has specific requirements, but these requirements don't cover usability. First of all, WCAG doesn't cover every single possible accessibility barrier out there. This is the first thing. That's why it is always essential that you go beyond WCAG. Another example is WCAG, for example, WCAG requires that if you have an interactive component, if something can be operated with a mouse, then it must be operable with keyboard. What if you decide to make it operable using keystrokes or keys that the user is not familiar with? Technically, you've conformed to WCAG because you can operate this thing that you've built. You can operate it using a keyboard, but it's not usable because if the user doesn't know which keys to use to operate it. Another example is links. There is a WCAG requirement that says that if you're using color to distinguish elements, then color is not the only way used to distinguish elements. But it doesn't say that you have to use color to distinguish certain elements. For example, say you have a link in the middle of a paragraph. If you use a color with a low contrast, if you just change the color of the link to distinguish it from the text, surrounding text, then you have to make sure that the color is accessible, probably even better add an underline, which makes it even more distinguishable from the surrounding text. But you don't really have to use color to distinguish text, to distinguish the link. So technically, you can keep the link the same color as the text, inherit the same color as the text, so it's no longer visually distinguishable from the surrounding text. That's still going to conform to WCAG. You didn't fail that criterion because you didn't use color to distinguish the links from their surrounding text. But the experience that you just created is terrible because nobody's going to be able to tell where the link is. This is two example. I can think of many more, actually. I'd rather not because otherwise I'm going to spend the next 5 or 10 minutes just talking about this.
But yeah, I guess it's more like not following it in the strict sense of like what the guidelines are putting out to make something official or accessible. Like it's going beyond that to make sure that it is accessible, but like you said, it's also thinking about usability in terms of that as the example with the links, making sure that a user actually knows that it's a link because it's visually different in multiple ways, or all the different sort of approaches we can take to make sure somebody knows something's a link. But yeah, it makes sense now, the making that distinction. I'm actually really curious. That's raised a lot of questions, but before we get into them, when you're talking about all of this, you clearly know what you're talking about. It's sort of like if you get me going down a CSS rabbit hole, I can just go and talk about anything and go on all my, tangents and everything. But I first knew about you mostly about learning about SVGs, and there was some CSS stuff along the way as well. But now, basically everything I see you doing is accessibility related, and I'm just curious about how and why, I guess, it became important to you Just because you'd written an article back in 2019 saying, what a year of learning and teaching accessibility taught me. And in that article, you said that a few years ago, you didn't know what the term accessibility meant, that you built websites that were partially inaccessible because you didn't know any better. And fast forward to 2019, and you were at that point writing, speaking, and running workshops on accessibility and how to build a more accessible and inclusive web. So yeah, that's a long introduction. Just to, I guess I'll start with what made you start thinking about accessibility more, or taking it as a more serious topic than you had been previously?
Okay, so I don't remember what it is exactly that I saw back then. I think it was somewhere around 2015 or 2016. I think it was around 2016. I don't know how, where. Maybe it was a talk, maybe it was an article, maybe it was a Twitter tweet. Twitter was Twitter back then. It was still the community platform that we all loved and where connections used to happen. Someone mentioned something about accessibility, and I hadn't heard of accessibility before that, not once. And I think that what got me intrigued is hearing something along the lines of, if it's not accessible, then you're basically building something that's not good. And that's what got me, I had a question mark inside of my head. I still remember that moment. I had a big question mark in my head, like, what is accessibility and how does it exactly relate to the work that I'm doing? So I did a little bit of searching around, just quick search. And then I learned that accessibility is about building websites and applications, or writing HTML and CSS, which is what I do as a front-end developer, writing HTML and CSS in a way that ensures that everyone, especially people with disabilities, are able to use what you're building. And then I saw a few examples of things that you're supposed to be doing, basic things like adding alt text to images, which I already did. But there were also other things like a few ARIA attributes here and there, be adding a label or a name to a landmark when necessary. And because I was working a lot with SVG back then, so I started with CSS, and then it was CSS and SVG. And then I started getting a little bit more into accessibility. I realized that SVG is a whole different domain. I'm not going to get into that because that alone is like the accessibility of SVG. I think I had just finished working on a project where we did use a lot of SVGs for data visualization and stuff like that. And learning what I learned about accessibility, I realized that the thing that I had just built for that client, it was not fully accessible. So there was actually mixed feelings. The first one was guilt, and the second one was a little bit of shame. Shame, nobody made me feel shame. It was something internal. I'll explain it now. So I felt guilty because I'm not the kind of person that would create barriers to access, at least not intentionally. I always had this image inside of my head, and I still do to date. What if I ever meet someone, if I'm at a conference or somewhere, even walking in the streets, and someone with a disability comes up to me and says, "Hey, Sarah, that website that you built, I'm trying to use it, but I can't because the way that you built it it's not making it possible for me to access it." That would make me feel terrible. That would make me feel extremely guilty. I'm not the kind of person that does that. I'm the kind of person who offers help to strangers without them asking. I have a lot of stories and anecdotes I could tell about that, but I'm not going to. So I felt guilty. I knew that I had to change that. And the second reason is I have a very, very high bar that I set for myself for the quality of work that I deliver. And here's the thing. If you're building web user interfaces, they're called user interfaces. You're building an interface that is meant to be used by people. And if people can't use that interface, then what's the point? Right? And as a web developer, we have a really big impact because we are essentially building the web, and not just the web. We're building the interface, what people interface with on the web. What people see, what people interact with. If you remove the U from the UI, then you're not really a UI developer anymore. You're not a user interface developer. You're just an interface developer. Or as my friend Scott O'Hara would say, you're just a developer. So yeah, I realized that I needed to change something. I needed to learn more about accessibility, and I started. How did I start? I started finding people who talk about accessibility, finding people who write about accessibility, looking into specifications. I'm one of the few weird people who love to learn from specifications directly. I started getting into that more and more, and then you start learning about screen meters and how to use a screen meter. I still haven't memorized all the key presses yet, but there are guides online that I can pull up whenever I need to test with one. There's something extremely satisfying about knowing that you're building something that is making a positive change in the world and that can literally change someone's life. I would love to mention something. I don't know if it's this is definitely a tangent. I don't know if it's considered out of context. Why am I focusing so much more on accessibility today? It's not just accessibility. So what I want developers to see or to get or to learn from my work is how to do what they do, but better by integrating accessibility into every step of the development process. So you're writing HTML, you should be thinking about accessibility. You're writing CSS, you should be thinking about accessibility. With what you do on a daily basis, writing code, it gives purpose to what you're doing. And this reminds me of this video. So when I first started in this field, I was very much focused on CSS. I wrote a CSS reference for code drops. At that time, CSS masks and filters and clipping were still fairly new. They were still making their way into browsers, and Adobe, the web platform team at Adobe, was working on these features. And I was working with some of the people at Adobe about learning about these features and writing tutorials about them. CJ Gammon, he was one of the most inspirational people that I had met in the first couple of years when I started in this field. CJ was working at Adobe. I don't know if he still is, but in order to showcase all the capabilities that CSS had introduced at that time, masking, clipping, filters, and all that stuff, they created this app. I'm looking at it right now. I would love for you to provide this as a link in the podcast notes or something. It's called, they built an application basically. They've collaborated with the Food Network to make, the video is called, it's on YouTube. It's called Making the Web Sweeter with Food Network and Cupcakes. Basically, they rebuilt an application. I think it was a native application. They built the web version of that application using web technologies. And basically, as I mentioned, CSS filters and a lot more. One of the most inspirational videos I've ever seen is this one because it starts at around 2 minutes and 18 seconds if you fast forward to that part of the video. CJ showcases how, people who are going to be using this application are people who are going to be cooking in the kitchen because it's an application that contains recipes for making cupcakes. And when you're making cupcakes in the kitchen, it's going to be all messy. Your hands are going to be messy. There's going to be flour everywhere. If you're using an iPad or a laptop, you probably don't want to touch that with your hands when they're dirty or messy. So what they did, which was something that it was the first time for me seeing that back then. They added 2 features to the application. The first one is speech recognition. So you could talk to the application and say the name of the recipe or the name of the menu or whatever that you want to go to. So you can use your voice to navigate the application. And the second one is he used a leap motion device. That was my first time ever seeing that, and it's really cool. A leap motion device basically allows you to also navigate the application using just moving gestures, air gestures. You don't have to touch anything. Just swipe left, swipe right in the air, and it's going to move through the recipes. The beautiful thing about this application is that they thought about the user before building the application. You think about how are my users going to use this, and then you make design decisions based on your user needs. Accessibility and inclusive design in general is also the same thing. You want to think about all the different ways that your users are going to browse and operate and use your websites and applications, and then you will make decisions, and whether it's design or development based on those needs. Hopefully, this is how you ensure that you build an accessible or inclusive application. This is it. So it makes a lot of sense because we are building for users, and ultimately what you want is to create something that is usable, and that's what got me into accessibility. I started diving more, I started learning more, and the more I learned, the more I fell in love with this because it raises the bar, and you can really stand out in the community if you're building with a certain level of quality. That was a long answer.
It's a great answer. I wish that all the terrible WordPress themes that do recipes could update and use something like that, because they're already bad enough with everything. But I do lots of cooking, so it's always frustrating, as you said, when you're trying to cook and not touch your phone, but look at a recipe. That definitely piqued my interest. I'm going to be watching that video, and I'll make sure to include links to it, or a link to it in the description. In a sense, though, I can definitely relate. Not a little bit with the accessibility side of things, because in my own sort of journey in learning more about it, I started making content, and then there'd be comments on videos or something that it wouldn't even be like, there wouldn't be negative comments. It would just be, what about this, or certain things, and I'd be like, oh, I hadn't even thought of that, or it wasn't part of my thought process at all. And that sort of, and the same thing, like you'd start seeing things on social media, or you'd find other people to follow that were more in that, and then you start learning more and more about it, and diving down that. And there's only one video I ever took off of YouTube, and it was looking at doing like a hamburger menu where I just made a div clickable.
No.
That was probably 7 or 8 years ago. And when I realized, it was, I think 2 years ago, I realized that video was up, and I was like, I think I was looking at the original demo, and I'm like, I'm going to take that down. And
It's going to make a lot of people angry.
Yeah, so I was like, let's take that one off. And I actually made a new video looking at why that was a mistake and what I learned from it, and, you know, hopefully that other people can take away from it.
I love that.
But I think, yeah, for me, I can relate in the sense that you're saying reading the spec and stuff. Like I have looked at that, but for me, it's usually in the CSS spec. But I usually regret every time I end up there. I don't enjoy reading it at all. I'm like, what am I doing here? Why am I? I think, I mean, for both of us, are you know, it's that thing that happened where we sort of found out slowly and learned a bit more about it and a bit more about it. And I'm curious, when it comes to accessibility, I think one of the biggest battles is just raising awareness of it in general. It would be fantastic if it was, you know, more something that we just took for granted at the very early stages when developers are learning, but it's obviously not the case still. So I'm just curious if you have any advice, tips, especially for someone like me who's very, I try to incorporate it, but if you have, you know, just in general, if somebody's, I don't know, do you have any solutions to raising awareness about accessibility in general and usability and inclusive web design?
Well, the best way to raise awareness is to not stop talking about it. The thing that you can do, especially as an educator, you have a big impact. And one of the most impactful things that you can do is show how accessibility can be a part of the normal thought process without making it feel like a burden, because you can go a long way making something accessible just by making small tweaks here and there. If you look at the WebAIM accessibility survey results, or WebAIM 1 million survey results, they basically survey the 1 million top websites and test them for how accessible they are. The most common accessibility issues that have been exactly the same for the past years are extremely easy to fix. So you have missing alt text on images, or buttons and links missing labels or accessible names. You have documents missing lang attributes. How easy is that to add? These are small fixes that go a long way. So, or what they call the low-hanging fruit. There are a lot of things that you can do, and I think that as a first step, as educators, what we can do is just like if I'm talking about a CSS feature, which is something that I recently did, I talked about the scroll target group property. We talk about how really awesome this thing is, and not this particular thing, but you know, anything that we're discussing in CSS or HTML. And just make accessibility part of the process. People at some point will get used to hearing, so this is how I can use it. How can someone else using a different way of navigating use this? If someone is using a keyboard, are they able to use it? If someone using a screen reader or speech recognition, how can they use it? Now, this is for us as educators. Just make sure that you add it to pretty much wherever appropriate. The spreading awareness, like I said, it starts with talking about this thing more. And then but then again, when you start spreading awareness, you're going to get some pushback, right? There's going to be some developers who are going to say that this is an edge case. We don't have any disabled users visiting our website, or accessibility is just about screen readers and none of our users use screen readers. So the first thing that I would do, that I almost always do when someone pushes back, is debunk the myths about accessibility. People think that accessibility is just about a blind person using a screen reader. People think that accessibility is just being blind or deaf, or having a motor disability, or sitting in a wheelchair. People think that there's only one type of disability, which is a permanent disability. People think that there's only one type of assistive technology, which is a screen reader. But when you talk about web accessibility, you talk about people that have disabilities that use assistive technology to access the web. There are so many different types of disabilities and so many different types of assistive technologies. Eyeglasses, you're wearing one, I wear one, I'm just not putting it on right now. Eyeglasses are a form of assistive technology. You know, these pencil grips that they give kids to help them grab pens and learn how to use it to write, those are assistive technology. Those are a form of assistive technology. Not all assistive technology is technology. Some of it is very, air quotes, primitive. Assistive technology on the web can be anything from a screen reader, things like head wands, mouth sticks, using eye tracking, using a keyboard. Keyboard is a form of assistive technologies. People use keyboards to navigate the web when they can't use a mouse. If they have an RSI problem, which is a very common problem with people like us who code all day. Assistive technology also includes forced colors modes and high contrast mode and zoom. How often do you zoom websites? I do all the time. Most of the websites I have open in my tabs right now are zoomed in. I'm getting old. My eyes are getting strained. When you spend 95% of your time in front of a screen, you're bound to eventually, need to start zooming in. So assistive technology is not just screen readers. And disabilities are not just being blind or deaf. You have permanent disabilities that you are born with or that you acquire during your lifetime. You have temporary disabilities, which anybody could have at any moment in their life. You could have, God forbid, an accident and break a leg or break an arm, and then you're not going to be able to use your mouse or your keyboard to navigate the web. Maybe in that case, you're going to have to use speech recognition. Will you be able to use your own websites or application if you have to do that? There's also situational disabilities. A situational disability is an example. These are examples that I'm borrowing from Microsoft. They have this really nice figure. It's very popular. I don't have a link to it right now, but it shows a grid. It shows you that disabilities can be temporary, situational, or permanent, and then it gives you examples of those. A situational disability could be, for example, a mother holding her baby and unable to use her arms to browse recipes, for example, or do something on her computer. A situational disability that also many people could be in any at any moment is being in a very loud room where you can't hear the person that you're talking to. This is a situational disability. So when we're talking about accessibility, we're not just talking about a few people with very specific accessibility needs. We're talking about a wide range of disabilities, a wide range of assistive technologies. And you're also, when you're building accessible websites, or you're also building it for your future self. So not only is now more than 1 billion people on the planet live with some form of disability, but each of us is bound to have some type of disability at some point in their lives. It could be as soon as next week, God forbid, if you have an accident or whatever. It could be maybe in your 60s, 70s, 80s if you get low vision or any glaucoma or any kind of other kind of disability. So yes, the first part is talk more about accessibility. When you get pushback, debunk accessibility myths, and then get people curious. And how do you get people curious? By making it relatable. One of my favorite ways to do that, this is something I actually picked up from Leonie Watson. So there's an interview with Leonie where someone asks her how she gets people, learn about accessibility. I'm going to quote her. I'm going to read the first part of what she said. One of the most effective ways actually in recent years has been to ask them if they use some kind of home assistant, Echo or Google Home or such. And many people, of course, now have. And then the next thing I ask them is, how many times have you had a screaming match with it because it just didn't do what you wanted it to do? It just didn't listen to you, it answered the wrong question, it started the wrong activity, and the answer comes back almost invariably. Yeah, that's the situation. And I'm like, well, then Leonie explains what using technology is like. So their experience with using the home assistant is very similar to the experience that someone using assistive technology has. It's very similar, the same frustrations. You have accessibility needs or disabilities, Leonie included, and as a screen reader user, we get to the point where we think we should be able to do something and it should be reasonably straightforward and possible to do. And we find we're just getting these kind of frustrating bumps in the road. So at that point, they stop talking about home assistants and they start talking more about accessibility and just getting people to know more about their frustrations. It gets them curious. If someone says, oh, hell, is that what the experience is like? That gets them curious. And then you can start taking the conversation in a specific direction. And Vitaly Friedman also has a post. It's about making a strong case for accessibility. And one of the things he mentions, like if you're trying to convince a stakeholder of the importance of accessibility. Now, today, because accessibility is the law, you are, you have to build something that's accessible because it's required by law. But I hope that this is the last resort. So you don't have to even get to that point where you have to talk about the law. Vitaly said that stakeholders often misread the value or the purpose of accessibility. And he says that you can't build empathy with numbers. So you can't just use reports and facts and charts in order to build empathy. Again, you make it relatable. If someone in the room is wearing eyeglasses, you talk about assistive technology and you show them example. And the best way for them to build some empathy is show them people using and trying to use their application or their product and seeing them frustrated, seeing how it feels for them. Yeah, so that's it. And then at some point, hopefully they will be like, okay, We want to make sure that what we're building is accessible. How do we go about doing that? And that's where you start getting more into WCAG. WCAG is the North Star, but it's not the end. WCAG is the baseline of accessibility. But that's where you would normally start because it's a set of guidelines. It guides you. You get the bare minimum with WCAG, and then hopefully you do a little bit more to make sure that it's usable and do some user testing, get real people involved and stuff like that.
Yeah. So yeah, that when you were talking a little bit earlier, it made me think a bit of I don't know if you know Salma Alam-Naylor, because she it was a while back now, probably 6 months ago. I did a quick talk with her because she'd lost the use of her hands and couldn't use the keyboard anymore, and was realizing how hard everything is all of a sudden.
I think I remember you seeing you posting about that. Yes.
Yeah, and it's a little bit like you said. It's not. I think a lot of people have that misconception that you said of when we talk about accessibility, we're just talking about screen readers, and there's so much more to it than just that. And even every time I've done videos that focus on or where I bring up keyboard navigation and stuff, it's not only, there's different reasons people might use it, and there's always people that are like, Vim user here who's very happy you're talking about this.
Yes.
It's
power users.
Yeah.
Accessibility benefits everyone.
Everybody. Yeah. I guess for me, when I started learning it, once I finally, once I started realizing it was important, my biggest issue, and I think a lot of people have the same thing, is finding it difficult to learn, or, it's like you said, that there's the WCAG, which I think not enough people know about. So that's the first place I think people should head to. But it's very dry. It's not like, if you're just starting to get into it, I could see some people like trying to wrap their mind around exactly, and they have examples.
It's also ambiguous in some places. Yes. And the same criterion can be interpreted in different ways. Even accessibility professionals sometimes have disagreements as to whether an issue, this particular thing, fails a WCAG criterion or not. There's, I totally understand the sentiment.
Yeah. So I'm just curious, like, say if you had somebody who was this is the first time they're hearing about accessibility, and now they want to learn more. You'd mentioned maybe some of the low-hanging fruit earlier as well, because I think it is one of those things where you can quickly get into the weeds, but it's probably best to start with the easier things. But do you have advice for people that are just learning about it, or wanting to wanting to learn more about it?
Okay, I'm gonna go back to when I started learning. Everyone's probably going to have a different path, but one thing I can recommend is try to find a structured path. So you could, just like if you learn CSS that way, that's how I learned CSS, is you just, whatever comes up in a Twitter timeline, an RSS, in a newsletter, when you hear about something, you find a blog post and you read about that. With accessibility, that helps. That's how I got started, definitely. And I ended up collecting everything that I know and turning it into something structured eventually. But it takes a lot more time than if you start with something structured. And I want to say this in a way that doesn't make accessibility sound like it's difficult. Accessibility is not always difficult. Now, there are certain things that are complex, that's for sure, because when you start creating complex interaction patterns, things are bound to get complex, right? Especially if you don't have any native HTML elements to represent those elements, to represent those interactions. I think we're going to talk a little bit about the technical side shortly. If you don't have a structured curriculum or some place that guides you from point A to point B. Point B, by the way, is not going to be the end point. You just need someone to guide you through the beginning so that you have all the necessary information, the foundational knowledge that you need so that you can keep going from there on your own. So there is no end. Accessibility is a process, it's not an end goal. So you're never going to just make something accessible and be done with it. That's another tangent, and I again lost my train of thought. So you need a structured curriculum. This is why I try to avoid tangents. You need a structured curriculum. One of the challenges with browsing the web for various articles about different topics is that you will definitely come across the same topic discussed by two different accessibility professionals, and there's almost always, not for every topic, but you will eventually come across something. You'll find an accessibility professional who has an opinion about this, and then you'll find another accessibility professional who has a different opinion on the exact same thing. And then if you ask a screen reader user about this thing, this is what I usually do. Like if there are varying opinions, I usually try to get a screen with someone, we're building for people with disabilities, right? So I try to go to the people that we're building for. If I can't do usability testing, I at least try to reach out to people. There are a lot of amazing disabled users available on social media and who love to be asked and who love to tell people what they need and how we can help them, how we can help make the web better and more inclusive for them. If you ask a screen reader user about their experience, you might end up hearing something also different. So there is some things in accessibility are black and white. There's right and there's wrong. Like if you're building a toggle button, there are certain accessibility requirements. If you're building a button that toggles the display of a navigation menu, or you will learn that you're going to need ARIA expanded on that button so that it communicates to screen reader users that this button toggles the display of something, and it communicates whether that thing that's controlled by the button is expanded or not expanded. These things are cut clear, but then there are some gray areas. You get to these when you start thinking about more complex interaction patterns and usability, not just accessibility. So when it comes to accessibility, and usability, there are certain expectations, guidelines like the Authoring Practices Guide, or also known as the APG. APG is helpful for me. I only look at it for one thing, is to get an idea of what ARIA attributes are expected. We'll talk about ARIA later. And the most important thing I look for is keyboard interactions, because there are certain keyboard interactions that are expected for specific interaction patterns. You can find those there. So try to find a structured curriculum, someplace to start. There are many courses online. You can start in any of those courses, of course. Another thing I would recommend, so we said that WCAG is a dry document, and it definitely is, and it's also ambiguous, but the WCAG is a normative document, so you have to conform to WCAG in order to be considered, for the website to be considered accessible. But WCAG also has supporting documents. So there's the Understanding WCAG document, and there is the Techniques for WCAG document. These are multiple page documents. The Understanding is very helpful if you are seeing a WCAG success criterion and you're not really sure what that criterion means or what the goals of that criterion are. You can go to the understanding page of that specific criterion, and it explains the purpose of this criterion, who it is for, who it benefits, and how you could be able to meet it. And then the understand document contains links to the techniques documents. So it takes you to pages where you get suggestions. So understanding WCAG and Techniques for WCAG, these are non-normative, aka informative documents, which means that you don't have to do exactly what they say, but they are a good place to start if you absolutely don't know where to start. And they're also a good place to just learn more about accessibility and about WCAG. In the techniques, you will find things like if you're providing content using CSS pseudo elements, make sure that if it's decorative that you hide it, or basically CSS techniques and HTML techniques to ensure that you could use in order to meet the requirements of the success criterion.
Right. Yep.
So there's WCAG, there's supporting documents, there's multiple more documents. There's ARIA and HTML is helpful. HTML accessibility API mappings if you want to get really deep into HTML and ARIA. There are those documents, but again, I highly recommend finding a structured curriculum to start before you start going into the weeds of different topics later.
I will say you're also being too humble and saying you can get any course. You do have your own course on this that people can use that I think is a very good course.
Thank you. As long as you find something structured and it meets your needs, then you should choose that. I don't want to come off as someone who's just trying to sell people something.
No, I know that.
I built a course that I wish existed. I built the thing that I thought was missing on the web. So would I recommend my course to someone getting started with accessibility? Absolutely. But I am biased. And if I say that, people are just going to think that I'm just trying to sell them my course. I mean, yes, it is part of my livelihood comes from that course. So it does matter to me, but I don't want people to buy it just because it's something I made. I got a few emails when I first launched the course from people asking me if the course is suitable for them. And a few of those people I recommended against taking my course and suggested other resources because they had specific areas of focus in their work. And my course is focused more on front development and HTML and CSS. So that's not going to be a fit for every single person out there.
So for those who I would recommend it, I have taken the course, so I highly recommend it. But we'll talk more about that maybe a little bit after. One thing you brought up a couple times there was ARIA, and I remember when I first started that was like, I feel like when you first start learning about some of the accessibility things with the simple things, or like the very easy things like, oh, don't take an outline off of a link, or there's a few simple things, and then all of a sudden you find out about ARIA and roles, and that opens up a can of worms a little bit. But just in case somebody's listening who isn't even familiar with what ARIA is, could you just give a really quick rundown?
Yeah, so ARIA is a web standard. Just like we have HTML, we have the HTML specification, we have CSS. We also have ARIA, which has been around, I think, since 2006. It's a web standard that defines a set of attributes. These attributes can be used to extend HTML semantics. It defines roles, states, and properties that you can use to make HTML element or HTML content more understandable by assistive technologies such as screen mirrors and speech control software. This is the short definition of ARIA. So it's a web standard that defines attributes. You can use these attributes to extend the capabilities of HTML when HTML semantics fall short. So ARIA has a specific use. It doesn't compete with HTML. It's not a specification that you have. You don't need to choose between HTML and ARIA. They complement each other. ARIA is, I like to think of it as an enhancement, a necessary enhancement a lot of times on top of HTML. So you start with HTML, do everything you can do with HTML. And if you have an interaction pattern that has specific requirements that you cannot find in HTML, that's when you turn to ARIA to find, the attributes that will help you communicate the meaning or the purpose or the interactions of what you're building.
Yeah, because we use, the classic saying is no area is the best area, in that if you don't use it, if there is the existing element that you could use instead.
No ARIA is better than bad ARIA. Yes, that's
right.
one.
Yes.
Sometimes
yep.
ARIA is going to be necessary because there are still
Yes.
certain things in HTML that HTML can't do on its own. So you will need ARIA for those things.
Yeah.
Hopefully it's going to be... No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think most of the time it's like you said, when it's more complex things you're like if you're building tabs or a carousel or something where there's an interaction going on where we don't have a native element for it.
A table grid or a list view and stuff like that.
Yeah. In the post that I mentioned off the very beginning, back from 2019, you actually wrote in there about ARIA, saying ARIA is like a polyfill for HTML semantics, which I thought was a very nice way of putting it for people who haven't heard of it before.
Yeah. So you usually turn to a polyfill when you need it. So you try to use a feature, and if support is missing in a specific browser, that's when you use a polyfill on top of the feature that you've already used. With HTML, it's also the same. So the reason accessibility professionals emphasize the fact that ARIA is a polyfill is because when developers learn about ARIA, there is this misconception that it's either ARIA or HTML. And because ARIA can do more than HTML in some places, then they just use ARIA and avoid using HTML. So there are rules to using ARIA, because overuse of ARIA or misuse of ARIA can create barriers to access for people. And that's going to be worse. So your intention would be to use ARIA to improve the user experience and to make something more accessible. But what you end up with is the complete opposite. Off the top of my head, ARIA label is an example. A lot of people throw ARIA labels here and there. They're not aware that ARIA label or ARIA attributes in general, ARIA labeled by and ARIA label. And when the browser needs to compute the accessible name of an element, ARIA takes precedence over HTML. So if you have a button that contains some text, what some developers will do is they will use ARIA label to provide additional description to the button, or they think that by using ARIA label, they are providing an accessible name to some users, whereas the label is going to also be accessible to... It's different. ARIA label is going to override the contents of the button. So if you provide a long sentence as a description in ARIA label, that is going to be exposed as the name of the button. It's like using that sentence as a label, and it doesn't make sense. So misuse and overuse of ARIA can create barriers to access. That's why there are rules for ARIA use. There is not sure which specification it is, but there are 5 rules of ARIA use. The first one is that if you can use a native HTML element or attribute to create the pattern that you're creating, then do that. Unless, of course, there are exceptions. If accessibility support is not there, or if there are styling limitations that you absolutely can't work around. So yeah, ARIA is a polyfill, and it's really important to keep this in mind. Another thing that can help with ensuring that you don't overuse ARIA is to think of it as a temporary solution. I heard this, I don't remember who said that a few years ago, but thinking of ARIA as just a temporary solution helps. ARIA provides semantics that are currently not available in HTML, but the OpenUI group is already working on adding more features and more elements to HTML, and these elements will implicitly map to ARIA attributes so that you no longer need to use those ARIA attributes. You will just use the native HTML elements, and using native HTML comes with a lot of benefits. Not all. This is one of my favorite things. I love talking about semantic HTML accessibility. And even in the course, in that, there's one chapter about semantic HTML accessibility. And at the beginning of the chapter, I say this is my favorite chapter of the course because there's a lot more to HTML than just tag names, right? HTML elements are meaningful. They are semantic, but they're not meaningful. And then there are also some misconceptions. Now I'm steering in a completely different direction here.
That's okay.
You'll often hear people say that div and span are not accessible or that they are not semantic. That's not true. They are semantic. Their semantic is that they are generic containers. And I have my friend Scott O'Hara to thank for the first time, I started thinking about HTML accessibility. It was because of this discussion I had with him. Div and span are semantic. They are generic containers. And even if you look at the accessibility tree in the browser DevTools, you will see that Chrome, for example, exposes them as generic containers, but they're not meaningful semantics. They're not useful for assistive technology users. So if you use a div to mark up a button, the user's not going to know that this is a button because the div is just a generic container. That's when you would have to use ARIA to polyfill the semantics that are missing on the div. But then there's a lot more work that you will have to do because just adding ARIA attributes is not going to make the div interactive. It's not going to turn it into a button. It's just going to tell the user that this is a button, but it's not really a button until you make it behave like a button. And so you need to make sure that it's operable using the space key and using the enter key, not just the enter key or not just the space key. There's a lot of work that you will have to do if you go the route of just ARIA, using div soup and then adding ARIA to add semantics. There's a lot of work that you need to do, but if you use native HTML elements, the browser is going to provide that functionality specifically for interactive elements. Is going to provide that for you.
I love that you brought up divs and spans there, just because I get comments on videos where I'll use a div for whatever, and someone will say something about, oh, but you should be using semantic tags. I'm like, I just needed to make 2 columns, so I just wrapped each one in a div because I'm like, there is no semantics. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not making a column. Like, that doesn't make any sense. And I'm just like, I think, some people seem to get stuck on, I guess it's, you learn first about divs and then you're like, oh, there's semantics, and you start doing that. And then you just they go too far down that side of things.
Yeah, like using divs and spans is all of the sudden taboo. It's not.
Yes, yeah.
They still have their use cases. They are generic containers, and you can use them to, create layouts or for styling hooks or whatever. You can even use them. You can use them anywhere as long as you've used the meaningful semantics to expose the most important part of the interface or the content to the user. Then you can use divs. Of course, there are also rules to that. So some elements, there are certain relationships in ARIA. If you have an element and you have a child of that element, sometimes the relationship is very strict. You're not allowed to have a div between the parent and the child. Otherwise, it breaks that parent-child relationship. That's a more advanced level of ARIA. We're not going to get into that now. But generally speaking, div and span are still useful. I use them all the time.
I will say though, I did a challenge on my Discord maybe about a month ago, and it's something I've been thinking about, how it just talking about semantic HTML, I think might make HTML harder than any other language, just because at first it seems easy, right? Like your heading levels work, and once you understand what they're actually doing, it's pretty straightforward. You have a main and you have a header, and like it seems like it's really straightforward, but then all of a sudden, because it's about the meaning of things and meaning is subjective, it gets a lot harder really fast. One of my favorite examples, I think it was Stephanie Eccles who brought it up, was talking about having a testimonial that has an image in a person's name, and they're like, should it be a figure? Should it be a block quote? Should it be a block quote inside a figure? And there's all the different, you sort of get into this rabbit hole sometimes when you start going into the semantics of something. I'm curious if you have any tricks or tips or anything just on that front there.
This is one of those scenarios where you will find different opinions by different people. My rule of thumb is, how is it exposed? There are certain elements. You definitely need to learn what each HTML element, what the purpose of that element is. You don't want to go using... This is a very extreme example, but you don't want to use a button to create a block quote, for example. You don't even want to use a block quote to create a pull quote, because a block quote and a pull quote is different. So what I would normally start with is, what exactly is the definition of a block quote? What is the purpose? How is it defined in the specification? There are also going to be some rules, markup rules, that you're allowed to nest this element in that one, or you're not allowed to do that. And then fire up a screen reader, see how it is going to be announced. So it's interesting because Adrian Roselli, this is also one of the links that you can include in the description later. Adrian Roselli has an article exactly about block quotes and how they are announced by screen readers. And he has this really long test page. There are multiple different markup patterns that you can use to mark up a block quote, right? Some of them is just a block quote. and then you follow the block quote with a paragraph that contains the site, which is not something I'm fond of. And then there is a block quote with the site inside of it. And then there's a figure and a fig caption. And then there's a block quote inside a figure with a fig caption. And then there's a block quote inside a figure with a footer instead of a fig caption. Yes, there are multiple constructs. Some of them are from the W3C website. Some of them are from the HTML working group. Some people prefer this, others prefer that. I like to base my opinions on actual test results. So there's this article by Adrian. I'm going to tell you what he recommends at the end of the article. Another article about the block quote element by Hayden Pickering, who's also great at accessibility. So they are both professionals, but they have opposite opinions. So Adrian says, don't use this particular construct, which is basically the one with the figure and the fig caption, if I'm not mistaken, because it's too verbose. It's not wrong. It's definitely not wrong because you're exposing information. But if you were to compare the output of using a figure and a fig caption with the output of using a block quote, for example, with which one is it? I think the one he uses is the block quote with a footer inside of the block quote and then the site inside of the footer. And I have a couple of notes on this now. Adrian prefers the block quote with the footer and the site inside of it, but Hayden prefers the figure and the fig caption. None of them is either right or wrong. They are both fine as long as you have markup that is valid. And a block quote in most screen readers, according to the tests in Adrian's article, most of them are exposed as, the screen reader announces quote, I think. It says block quote. So it is announced as a block quote. And just as an aside here, not all screen readers need to announce the exact same thing all the time. So if you're going to be testing the screen readers and something is not announced the exact same thing in all screen readers, that's fine, as long as you get the general idea. I would vote for Adrian's suggestion as well, because first of all, using figure and fig caption is not wrong. It's just more verbose, right? So if you do usability testing, if you're able, and I hope you are, because I think it would be fantastic, and you get amazing insights when you see people with disabilities using your work. Maybe your users will say that the figure and the fig caption is just fine, so you would just use that. Or you will use a block quote. I personally use the block quote with a site inside of it. I don't use a footer. A note on using the footer inside of block quote, it's not going to be exposed as a footer because a footer is only going to be exposed as content info when it is in the context of, it's a direct child of the body element, but some things are going to change in the future. These are outside of this conversation. I think there are some changes coming, so footer and header are going to be announced differently in different contexts. That is a side note. Yeah, so it also helps to understand how something is going to be exposed. So when it comes to landmarks, you have main, header, footer, and article and stuff like that. Once you understand how something is going to be exposed or not exposed, that gives you the flexibility and leeway or space to choose whatever you want. For example, I use the header element and the footer element all the time just as styling hooks. These are semantics that I add in my HTML for myself because it makes it easier for me to read, and I use them as styling hooks in CSS. I know that the header inside of my article element is not going to be exposed as a header. I know that the footer inside of the block quote is not going to be exposed as a footer, but it's just there to add some for yourself, or to make the code readable if you're working in a team. So yeah, sometimes there's not going to be a right or wrong answer. There are some rules that you're going to have to follow to make sure that the markup is valid. Other than that, whatever works, fire up a screen reader, test it. If you get different announcements, that's fine. And you will definitely have cases for native HTML elements that are announced completely, very differently across browsers and screen reader combinations. And the summary element is one of that examples. It is announced as a button in some browser and screen reader combinations, announced as summary in others. I think it's announced as a push button. It's also announced even disclosure triangle instead of summary or button. Yeah, so that's fine. And if you also want to get really deep into this, you check the HTML accessibility API mappings or the core accessibility API mappings, which gives you an idea of how each HTML element is exposed, if it is exposed, and the accessibility API of each platform. And when you see the same element exposed in different ways, that's when you can expect that element to be announced differently across screen readers, and that's fine. You don't have to work around these announcements. One thing people would normally do, I know this answer is getting too long, but I would love to mention this. One thing a lot of developers would do is, if they don't know better, if they think that a screen reader needs to announce the summary the same exact way across browsers and screen readers, is they will add the button role to it, for example, so that it is announced as a button everywhere. But if you do that, the button element, the native button element, doesn't come with state. You will in some browser, and I think it was VoiceOver when I did the latest test. I'm currently updating one of the course chapters with this update. I redid the tests, and I think it was VoiceOver. So basically, the summary element comes with state built into it. The screen reader is going to announce whether the disclosure widget is open or closed. But if you add roll button to it, you lose that state announcement. So don't try to work your way around native API mappings, basically.
Yeah, and I guess users, like, it's not like a user's jumping between different screen readers. They're used to the one they're used to, so they know what, when it's announced a certain way for that user, that's what they expect. And by trying to change that, it might even be worse. Yeah.
Yes.
Speaking of screen readers, for me, it still is a bit of a struggle in that I remember the first time I'm like, oh, I can just open up Narrator on my computer and let's see what happens. And I'm like, oh, everything, like it's not this, I'm trying to think the right way to describe it. You sort of have to dive right into it, right? Like there's not like this gentle path into starting to use a screen reader. It starts doing its thing. And if you don't know how to use it, you sort of are stuck and you might not even be able to exit the screen reader and it just keeps talking to you. I'm just curious for people who are, they might have their own personal site and they just want to test it out for fun. Do you have any tips for people who have zero experience?
Well, the quickest tip is if you want to make the screen reader just shut up for a second, just press the control. That's going to make it just pause for a second. But as soon as you start moving around, navigating through the website, it's going to start talking again. I still get stuck all the time as well. Even when I think that I finally, I know what keyboard combination to use. For some reason, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So I get just as frustrated still. But to get started, something I did at home was I had all keyboard shortcuts for all screen readers printed on paper. I had them sitting next to me. So if I'm going to test using NVDA, there are certain things that you're almost always going to want to do. Like one of the things is you want the screen reader to start reading the page top to bottom just to see if it makes sense. If you close your eyes and you're just listening to the screen reader, does it make sense? The structure, the order, the elements, how are they announced? And then you're going to do things like navigate by landmarks. Does it make sense? Are all landmarks exposed? You're going to navigate using headings. Does the heading structure make sense? You will navigate using keyboard. You will check if you can use different elements. There's going to be a lot of manual testing involved, and there are specific keyboard shortcuts for these tests. Try to memorize them. The more you use a screen reader, the more you will eventually. It becomes muscle memory. For me, it hasn't yet. I'm on macOS. I've gotten used to VoiceOver more, but I find NVDA to be the easiest to use. I don't know. It's the only one where I can navigate through the page and it just does what I expect it to do. I have a VM, I have a virtual machine installed on macOS so that I can test on Windows because JAWS and NVDA are the most popular screen readers. Test in the most popular screen readers. And the WebAM surveys also help you get an idea if you absolutely have to choose specific browser and screen reader combinations, if you can't test in all of them. I don't think a lot of people can unless it's their job to do it. It helps you get an idea of which browsers and screen reader combinations to use. So there's NVDA with Firefox or NVDA with Chrome. JAWS is most often used with Chrome as well, sometimes with Firefox. VoiceOver works best with Safari. They are made for each other, but some users will also use VoiceOver with other browsers. But if you absolutely have to choose, I would say VoiceOver with Safari, Firefox with NVDA, and Chrome with JAWS.
So far, we've been talking a lot about semantics, ARIA, and other things, but I don't think we can get through a conversation with me without talking about CSS. And
Yay.
CSS does play a role in accessibility as well. Earlier on, I mentioned the outline none that is still plaguing the internet somehow these days. But outside of, say, contrast ratios, because you're setting inaccessible color combinations or doing something like an outline none, how else can CSS impact accessibility?
So CSS can affect the accessibility information of HTML that is exposed to screen readers. There are the simplest example and the most common example is the display property. If you set the display none, then you're removing the element completely. You're making it inaccessible to all users, and the browser is not going to even include it in the accessibility tree. Just a short, I've mentioned the accessibility tree before. The accessibility tree is the structure that the browser creates from your HTML and CSS. All the HTML elements that you're using, this is a very simplified definition. So basically, the browser goes through all the HTML elements on the page. It finds the ones that carry meaning, and it also checks your CSS. It's going to check how the CSS, if an element is hidden using display none, then it's going to remove that element. It's not going to include it in the accessibility tree, and so it's not going to be exposed to assistive technologies. There are other attributes that also affect accessibility. Some of them are fairly new. They haven't been implemented yet. I think there's the interactive attribute and the enter activity property. It's not there yet. Other parts of CSS also affect accessibility in different ways, like pseudo content. You have the before, after, and the marker elements, the pseudo elements. You can add content to the page using CSS. The contents of pseudo elements contribute to the accessible name computation of an element. And that's why it matters what you add via CSS. If you're adding images and these images are just decorative, these images might end up being announced as part of the element's accessible name, which is weird. So you'll want to be able to hide them. And now we have this the slash syntax for the content property, which you can use to add alt text for meaningful content. Though the recommendation is to avoid using CSS to add meaningful content and make sure that the meaningful content still belongs in HTML, because CSS is not always going to load. And there are also other usability issues, like CSS pseudo content is not searchable using find in page, if I'm not mistaken. It's also not selectable. So the rule of thumb is keep meaningful content in HTML. And if you're adding decorative content using CSS, hide it by using the slash syntax. Make sure you do that. I have an article actually on that. I was working on it last week and then I got preoccupied. I was supposed to release it yesterday, but that's probably going to end up being either later this week or next week, early next week. It's all about alt text for CSS generated content. And then we have some of the new CSS stuff like CSS carousels. I mentioned the scroll target group property earlier. I wrote an article about this. I don't know if people are aware of it already. So basically what this property does is it promotes a group of regular HTML anchor elements or links into what is known as a scroll marker, which allows you to create effectively the bootstrap scroll spy effect. The bootstrap scroll spy effect is where you have a set. I'm going to give the most basic example is you have a set of links like a table of contents, a sticky table of contents on an article page. And as the user scrolls through the article, when you reach a section, the link to that section gets highlighted in the table of contents. So historically, we've had to use JavaScript to create this effect, to use something like intersection observer to find which section is currently in view and then find the link to that section and then add like a class name or something to it to use it in CSS as a styling hook. The scroll target group property and the CSS overflow module level 5, basically the main premise of this specification is to allow you to create things like scroll markers or the scroll spy effect using only CSS. And this is where CSS starts to get more into, instead of just affecting the visual presentation of elements, it starts to implement functionality. So it's less so with scroll target group, because with scroll target group, the browser is going to determine which link is active. And that link, when the browser determines that it's active, it's going to match the target current pseudo selector. And then you can use that to highlight the link visually. But the thing is, when you highlight the link visually, you are communicating the state of the link, that it's currently active. You're providing visual affordances, and you need to make sure that these visual affordances are also communicated to screen reader users. And how do you do that? You're going to need ARIA, because a link by default, there is no HTML native way to indicate that a link is active. That's where you would turn to ARIA, and ARIA provides an attribute called ARIA current. And when you use ARIA current on a link, it's going to be exposed to screen readers as the active link. But the browser is doing now, this is supposed to be a CSS-only solution to creating the scroll spy effect. Right now, the browser determines which link is active, and you can style it using CSS, but it does not communicate that same information to screen readers. So the active link needs ARIA current on it. Right now, it's not added by the browser, which currently the only browser that supports this. It's an experimental feature, and Chrome is the only one that supports it. I filed an issue, and there's currently a work in progress patch, so hopefully this will be resolved, because if the browser doesn't add ARIA current for you, you're going to have to use JavaScript to add ARIA current. So you will eventually need to use JavaScript. This is one example where CSS is starting to affect more than just the visual presentation and more than just including or excluding an element from the accessibility tree or accessible name computation. And then you have the other parts of the CSS overflow module, which you use the scroll marker group. So there's the scroll target group used to promote HTML links into scroll markers. And then there's the scroll marker group property, which can be used to create scroll markers. So the first property is you have HTML elements and you're enhancing them into scroll markers using a couple of lines of CSS. But the other parts of the specification, the browser is going to create elements for you. And so basically CSS is crossing the line from just being a visual presentation language into something that is creating functionality. I don't like that. This is a very personal opinion. I'm a proponent of the principle of separation of concerns. I think that CSS should do what CSS does. But if this is something that is going to be implemented eventually, there is going to be, going to need to raise awareness. Because as far as I know, the last thing I learned about this is the browser is not going to do everything for you when you use CSS carousel properties. There are still things that you will need to do. So you will need to learn about accessibility. You will need to learn about the requirements for the interaction patterns that you're creating. So at the end of the day, you will need to understand HTML. You will need to understand the accessibility requirements, and then see, you can use the CSS feature or whichever feature it is. There are now also HTML primitives like the popover API. These primitives or these HTML features provide a specific set of features, right? And then you need to compare that set of features that is provided by the browser to the requirements of the pattern that you're creating. You have certain requirements. Do these features and primitives provide all of the necessary requirements, or is there something that you will need to add on top of that? So the popover API, which is a completely different topic now, it provides certain functionality. There are some semantics that are also added when you use it. But if you're creating more complex patterns with it, you will most probably going to have to add some semantics in ARIA to make it fully accessible. I forgot where we started.
That's okay. Even the popover is a good point to get to, just because I'm between using popover. I was doing something, I don't remember what it was. I wish I could, but it was, is it a popover? Is it a modal? Which type of modal would it be if it is a modal? Is it like, and you're just sort of looking at all this going, oh my goodness, this is way more complicated than I thought it would be, now that we have these native features that sort of are supposed to be helping us and exposing these things for us.
Once you understand what a feature does and doesn't do, the doesn't part is very important, it gets a little bit easier. So you can just have a list of, okay, this is what this feature does, and this is what I need. And you can just compare the two lists and see what you need to do.
Yeah. When going back to the direction, I guess we could say CSS is sort of heading with, adding the content like it's doing with some of the carousel spec. I guess I have two questions there, because I know that from secondhand information, because I haven't read everything on it, but from what I understand, the level 2 spec there actually sounds, that's where you'll be able to connect things. Like you say, you build out all of the elements yourself, and then you can make the connections between them yourself, which to me sounds like maybe it should have been the original implementation, or they should have waited, or I guess do you think on some things maybe they're rushing, like let's get the level 1, because obviously I know the browsers tend to work that way, is let's make the easier to implement one, and then we add the complexity in a level 2, or they did that with grid grid with subgrid, and we've seen a few cases of that. Do you think part of it, especially with the speed of CSS, are they just trying to add more stuff a little too quickly, or do you think that's a little bit not even the issue? It's more about that idea that we shouldn't be even impacting we're entering CSS into this new realm that maybe it wasn't originally cut out for.
A strong opinion about entering CSS into this realm that it wasn't originally made for, because things on the web change, things evolve, and sometimes it can be for the better. So I'm not a person I do love the principle of separation of concerns, but some changes can be good. But with respect to the CSS carousels module, I haven't heard of what you just said. Like, I'm not sure. I do think it moved way too fast. I don't have any insider information or anything, but I suspect that if this was tested, if they had real assistive technology users test this, they would probably maybe not have implemented it the way they have implemented it at the moment. So I feel like it needs a lot more review, a lot more discussion. I think it did move really fast, and I don't know, it just came out of nowhere, for me at least, because one minute there was no CSS carousels thing, and then the other minute there was this CSS carousels gallery and this new specification, and was already implemented in Chrome, and I hadn't heard of it before. Few people in the accessibility community had heard of it. Most that I know hadn't. Yeah, I think it was a little hasty.
I think part of it, what's been happening anyway, at least with some of the things that are Chrome only right now, is Chrome's proposing something and they're prototyping it at the same time, which makes sense because it's nice it's nice to, when you have a proposal, it's nice to be able to play around with it in a browser. But the problem is then it's going from canary behind a flag to somehow being in production really quickly, even though it's still just a proposal.
Yes.
Then it feels like we should be using it because it's now in the production version. And I'm just like, oh, that went really fast. And why can't it just stay behind a flag for a while? Or just keep it in canary and don't, like, I guess they have their own ways of working. I don't know. I'm not involved in that. But sometimes I'm just like, leave it in canary without the flag. Who cares? No one's using that except developers anyway. And then at least it exposes it to this. Because I think, in them putting it out, it has raised concerns about how it's done. So we'll see what happens with the spec moving forward on that front. And with that, though, I am curious at your thoughts, because I think a lot of interactive elements in general are really badly done from an accessibility point of view. Do you think there's benefit to, say, a carousel like this that is, say, good but not great? Or, I don't, maybe depending on how you feel about it, but let's say it was good and not great. Is that better to have than people rolling their own solutions that tend to be worse? Or is it something that, because it is part of the spec, that it's either it should be perfect or not done?
I think if the browser is going to do it for us, it should do it right. I shouldn't need to do anything on top of what the browser already does, but that's not the case. The last information that I had about this proposal is that even when it's done, there are still things that you as a developer will need to be aware of and that you will need to add in your HTML to ensure that it is fully accessible, because there are certain parts of this that the browser is not going to do for you. Is it better than developers implementing their own not great version of these components? The only benefit for me personally is if the browser is going to do something so that I have to write less JavaScript, the less JavaScript I need to write, that's great. But personally, I would prefer if that happened in HTML instead of CSS. So instead of using CSS to create these tabs, and not all components, semantics of tabs are very specific. They can be used. There has been a discussion in the accessibility community. You could technically and even theoretically create a carousel using tabs semantics, because there are some similarities between these two patterns. But what if a developer uses this feature for something completely different? They find a different use case. They create a different interaction pattern. That interaction pattern exposes the semantics of tabs, but it's not really a tabs component, and it's not even a slider component. What happens there? Another thing is, this is the problem, because if the browser is going to do this thing for them and it's going to expose certain semantics, and the user, by user, I mean the developer, and the developer is not really aware of what's happening behind the hood. All they see is, I use this property and it magically generates these dots and tabs. That's enough. If they don't know what's happening in the background, they can end up misusing it. And that's my primary concern. So I think that nothing is a substitute for proper learning. Developers need to understand HTML. They need to understand semantics, what's being exposed, what's not. They need to make it a habit to open the browser DevTools, get the accessibility tree, see what exactly is being exposed to screen readers and does it make sense or not. You have this component on screen. Check out, how is it exposed? Are the semantics exposed descriptive of the pattern that you're creating, or are they completely separate, different? I personally prefer if browsers worked like with the OpenUI to create a tabs or a carousel component in HTML, and that component would come with semantics built in. It would come with interactions built in, just like we have now a disclosure widget. The menu element is being worked on, which allows us to create action menus, which is very different from navigations. There was a discussion, tabs and carousels were part of a discussion, but they're inactive at the moment because there are other things taking priority. So yeah, that's where my preference is. I would prefer if we did get these things for free, but in HTML where they belong. So we still have that separation of concerns. And when you do that, when developers learn HTML, they will learn about what comes with this feature and what doesn't come with it and how it works behind the scenes. But you've moved the semantics up a layer into CSS. And when I last checked the specification didn't even talk about accessibility and how these elements, you're using CSS to generate elements. What are these elements mapped to? And these mappings are going to determine the suitable places or interaction patterns to use these elements in. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I'd heard about that they were working on something for carousels quite a while ago, and I was expecting it to be an HTML thing first thing, and when it was all CSS, I was quite surprised when it, because like you said, it just sort of happened all of a sudden. I was like, oh, okay, that's interesting. And I haven't done much with it at all, and your post on them was one of the in-depth things that have given me some hesitation to diving deeper into it, but at one point I will have to play with them, I think,
Yeah.
just to see what's happening.
What I found frustrating is when you create the pseudo elements, when these dots are created, you can't really see them. They're not there. You're going to have to use anchor positioning and scroll snap to get the visual effect that you want, and
Right.
you have to
Yeah.
use anchor positioning. So you need to be aware, you need to be comfortable using all those features. I'm not very comfortable personally using CSS scroll snap. I've never really used it. So I'm going to have to learn that too in order to create the CSS carousel the way I would want it to. So like I said, if CSS carousels do make it into production in all browsers at some point, there will be some learning that needs to be done. There will be CSS learning, there will be HTML accessibility, and there will probably eventually be work that the developer will need to do to make them fully usable.
That's a nice segue into something I want to talk to you a bit about, because you mentioned you haven't really used scroll snapping. And like I said, from the very beginning, I learned, when I first found you online, a lot of your content was SVGs, but you also had CSS content before transitioning to do a lot of accessibilities. But the other day, you mentioned how CSS has changed so much over the years. And you were asking other people if they were able to keep up. I'm curious if you've been able to keep up with everything that's going on.
I've been able to keep up knowing what's coming, but not learning or using it. And to be honest, a lot of the new features I don't have any use cases for them in my day-to-day work. So when it comes to layout, CSS grid, flexbox, these things, yes, absolutely. The has selector is where things that you will use in base style sheets and stuff like that, basically anything related to CSS architecture and layout, these are things that are very practical and things that I would use every day. My absolute favorite CSS additions are all the new properties and the syntax, like the slash syntax for the content property, everything that makes it possible for us to improve the usability of interfaces. That's my sweet spot there, the sweet spot between accessibility and CSS. That's where I love to live. I don't use most of the features. I haven't used scroll snapping yet. I haven't used scrolling animations yet. I've only recently added transitions to my website, view transitions, geometry, complex calc functions. A few years ago, when I moved my website from Jekyll to Eleventy, I wrote some CSS back then. I was reading that CSS a couple of days ago. I don't know what I was doing. I literally don't understand what I wrote a few years ago. And that's not the CSS I want to write. I don't care if something is just a one-liner. I don't care if it looks really smart when you look at it. If I can't read it 1 or 2 years later, I'm probably not going to use it. And I'm currently not working on any projects with teams. So I have the freedom to choose what I use and what I don't use. And I will most likely be using primitive CSS more than all the fancy new features, like geometric functions, sine and cosine and calculations. All of these are completely not interested.
Interested in them, but not in using them myself, because every time I see them used, I'm just like, I know I'm not going to understand exactly what's happening here, but I'm always impressed when people are able to
With
use
the
them
results,
to do cool
yes.
things.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I was talking with Amit Sheen the other day, and he was showing me some stuff he's doing with them, and I'm just like, that's cool. I'm so overwhelmed just trying to understand what it is, but
Yeah.
I'm glad that it does. But I do think that as much, one of the things I like about CSS today is like it does feel like, oh my, it is getting more complicated in a sense, but you don't need to use any of that extra stuff if you don't have a need for it. Like for a beginner learning it now, it might seem like a much bigger undertaking than when we started with it. I think, and in a sense, I know we're adding CSS4 and CSS5, and part of the reason for that idea, from what I understand, is to sort of say like learn, CSS3 is sort of the foundational parts, and then these other ones are sort of additions on top that you won't need at the beginning. And I think it's nice that a lot of new things are becoming easier. Like even some of the things like interpolate size for some
I love
simple
that feature.
Yeah, like these little things that are just like, I didn't know I needed that, but I'm so glad we have it now. Or, well, that one I knew we needed, but there's other examples of like small things that, or even some like the scroll-driven animations, you might never need it, but you might come across a project where you go, oh, thank God they have that, because it's so much
Yeah.
easier than it would have been without them.
And the best parts are the ones that we can add as an enhancement.
Yes.
You don't need to wait for cross-browser support for those.
Yeah. I'm curious if there's any features that don't exist that you wish did exist.
The only thing that I would, like, if someone asked me what I would want more interoperability and better support for existing things, HTML and CSS, both at the same time. So Jen Simmons, I think, asked a while ago on Mastodon, like, if there's one thing that you would like Safari to support this
Yes, I
year.
saw that, yep.
My request was content property support on the marker pseudo element, because right now Safari is the only browser that doesn't allow you to change the marker using the content property. It's stuff like that. So it's very small things, useful things that you actually use in your day-to-day projects, but it doesn't work in all browsers yet. I would rather browsers spend more time on ensuring interoperability of existing features before they moved on to new features.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we're seeing that more, especially with the interop. Actually, you could submit that now, maybe. I think the submissions are open for interop 2026 right now.
2026.
Yeah. So at least we have something, but again, they only focus on a subset of things. So there's always some that go by the wayside. And sometimes it's those little ones that we wish we had because it seems simple enough, and it's silly that it's not there. So I don't want to steer too far off of CSS, but one thing I do have to ask, because it's impacting everybody right now, is AI. And I don't even want to worry too much about your thoughts in general. I have thoughts. I think everybody has thoughts on it as just a product in the world. But just in terms of accessibility, I'm very curious what your experience has been, because I've dabbled with it. I do it more for testing, and I do it with CSS too. Like a new model comes out, and I'm like, is it actually going to be able to do anything? And most of the time, if I ask it to write HTML for something, it's just div soup. And then if I ask it to make it accessible, it does a little bit like we were talking about earlier, where all of a sudden there's ARIA roles all over the place that are conflicting with the semantic elements it's put on there. I haven't done any testing recently, so maybe there's a model that's better at it. But I'm just curious if you've had any experience with it, better or worse than mine.
Not personally. I've only experimented with it just to see how good it was. That was, I think, a year or so ago, and I mostly rely on other people's experiences, accessibility professionals testing AI. The last thing I read was that AI is getting better at describing the contents of images, but even if it does, you will still need to check that the description actually matches what you're trying to communicate with the image, because the contents of the image can be described. Like you can see a dog, and there it can say it will tell you that there's a dog, but maybe it's not the dog that you want to focus on. Maybe it's something specific about the dog. That you can have a portrait. Why are you showing this portrait? Are you just talking about different kinds of typography, or is it the person or what they're wearing? You will eventually need to do the double checking yourself to make sure that what AI is generating is actually useful. There is also something I wish more people kept in mind is AI, artificial intelligence, is not intelligent. It's not, you're not really talking to someone carrying a PhD or someone who's smarter than you. It is indexing content, I think. I'm not even interested in the technical parts of that. Basically, it's just collecting whatever it finds on the internet, and then it's giving it to you in a different way. And because there's a lot of misinformation, accessibility misinformation on the web, it's not doing much better. I don't rely on it. I don't use it. I do ask ChatGPT questions sometimes when it comes to vocabulary. So I use it as a dictionary. If I can't find the exact word that I want when I use DuckDuckGo, I'll just ask ChatGPT, because it's able to pick the exact word or give me a few options for words. So it's just a language assistant in that sense that I sometimes use, but I don't use AI for other things. I know this is controversial, and if you use AI, you're going to be more productive, blah, blah, blah. But I enjoy the process. First of all, I'm much faster building something myself if I know how to build it, like writing HTML and CSS. I'm much faster doing it myself than having to prompt AI and then fix their mistakes and tell it, no, don't do that, do that. I hate that. That's why I've never used CSS frameworks, because I've always been faster writing my own CSS instead of having to clean up all the stuff that CSS frameworks added. I'm not a huge AI fan. In terms of accessibility, you have automated accessibility testing tools. They will be able to help you do some things faster, but they're not going to be able to replace you, especially when it comes to accessibility, at least not yet. And I don't know if that's going to change in the future. I think it's going to take a lot of time before that happens, if it happens.
Yeah, I think accessibility in particular is something that struggles with, like you said, because there's so much bad information, and what it's scraping from, I think a lot of the time it's looking at just examples that are out there, like you said. So it doesn't go and look at the WCAG to figure out what it's supposed to be doing. It just goes, oh, here's something that seems to be using semantic elements. That must be the right way to do it.
Yeah.
And does it. No, yeah, I agree with you. The I'm not, in terms of productivity, it's the most frustrating thing in the world. And I think I was reading something the other day about, because I was surprised. It's someone with one of the high ups at AWS saying that any company that's replacing junior engineers with it is making a mistake, because you need someone right now, maybe it can, and even then I don't think it can, but say it could even do the job of a junior. If it can't do the job of a senior, who's going to be your senior in 5 years when you have no juniors that are working on these skills and getting better at things? And yeah, I'm curious on what the impact is going to be going forward, but I've already seen on LinkedIn, there's like jobs, I don't remember how they called it, but it was someone posted on Blue Sky, it was like 20 different people that all had this role, AI cleanup engineer or something like that, right? And it's just like fixing the problems of AI. Shifting gears again,
Okay.
we talked a little bit about it. You have your course, Practical Accessibility, which again, very happy to recommend it, but more of a personal standpoint than like the content itself, because I've made several courses over the years. I'm curious what your experience in creating a course of that. It was a pretty big course, and what how it went and the process of doing it all was. You already mentioned that the reason you created it is you wanted to create something that you wish you had when you first were trying to learn about all this. So that guided path that you were talking about.
Yes, there's also a little bit more background to that if you would like. So when I decided to create the course, COVID had just hit. I think it was that year or the year before. Before COVID hit, I was running workshops on accessibility at events and conferences online over the world, basically in-person events. And I'm not really a fan of running workshops online. That is slightly changing. I have plans for 2026 that I haven't announced yet, but hopefully I will in next month. I'm not a fan of running workshops online. I think someone did ask me if I could run the same workshop that I was running at the conference, but run it online. I didn't want to do that. And, the internet connection in Lebanon is not really that great. And it's just different. In person is much better. I prefer it. I prefer in-person events. But I had all of this content from the workshop, and I had all of this accumulated knowledge over the years, and I wasn't sure what to do with it. And what good is knowledge if you have it and you don't do something good with it, or if you don't share it with people? Because when you share it, it multiplies, and people learn more, and they experiment more, and they create something better than what you have. So I knew that I wanted to do something with the content that I had. The first thing that I thought of is maybe I could write a series of articles. So basically turn the workshop content into a series of articles. But that brings me back to what I mentioned earlier about not having a structured curriculum. If I have a bunch of blog posts on the blog and someone wants to learn about accessibility, how do they know where to start or which article to move from? I wanted something a little bit more structured. And that's what got me thinking about turning it into basically recording the workshop itself as it was exactly, but recording it at home and then making the videos available on demand. But as soon as I started turning the workshop, I wanted to review the content to make sure that it's not missing something. And I thought I think I made the announcement in May or June or something. I thought that the course was going to be ready in like 2 or 3 months. Boy, was I mistaken. I'm really glad that the first video, the announcement video, I was going to mention that the course is going to be available this summer. I'm so glad I never did that. It took me 1.5 years or 2 years, a little less than 2 years to finish the course. The main reason is that I did everything on my own. I built the course website. It's a custom platform. I did everything myself, all the research. I had a couple of friends. I had Scott O'Hara and Adrian Roselli. Thank you so much for both of them for reviewing the content of the chapters. I also did hire someone to work on the back end of the website because I'm not a back end developer. But everything else, everything I did myself, including designing. I'm using air quotes here because I'm not a designer yet. So I did the entire website. I did the platform, the content, video recording, video editing. I learned so much. I underestimated the effort and the time required to create a course, but now I know better. So for my next course, I'm going to announce it at a proper time, and I'm going to make sure that I set expectations straight. People have been incredibly supportive. I mean, I was really being hard on myself, and that's why I burnt out while I was working on the course, because all the time I had this pressure on myself. You told people that it's going to be ready in whatever, by the end of the year. Even though I never really gave a specific deadline, but I had this deadline in my mind all the time. I burnt out, and I pushed through burnout for an entire year. And then a week before I published the course, things started changing in the region here, and the situation got worse, and the burnout got worse. And but this course is one of my absolute favorite things that I've worked on. I've learned so much working on it. Yeah, I'm very proud of it.
Yeah, I'm impressed that you're planning another one, because I know for a lot of people they're like, "Oh my goodness, I'm never doing that again. It was way too much." I still haven't learned my own lesson about. I always think I can do one in like 6 months, and then it never happens. The one thing I did learn is the first time I did it, I did give a release date, and then on the website I had to keep changing the release date to like 6 months later, and so I don't do that anymore. I'm not announcing it until I'm like 95% done, and then I'll give once I'm just doing the finishing touches, then I'll be like, okay, in 2 months I'm releasing this.
Yeah, that sounds like a good plan.
On a completely another shift of topic now, but just before I let you go, just wanted to bring up a while ago, I posted a picture of some sourdough bread that I'd made. I think that was back when we were both still using Twitter, so it was a while ago. And you'd mentioned that you've never made at that time you hadn't made your own bread, but you were making almost everything you eat, which included mayonnaise and a few other things. As someone who gets into lots of like weird hobbies and stuff, I sort of get it, but I am curious. For me, bread making is a lot easier than making my own mayo. I don't know. I still haven't tried.
Whoa, really?
But I'm just, yeah. Maybe it's just a preconception I have. But I'm curious
Definitely
how you got
is.
into. I like making stuff. I've done sourdough. At one point, I was making kombucha. I make my own beer. I just like learning about the process as much as anything.
Fermentation, lots of fermentation.
Yes, I'm definitely into
involved.
fermentation in general. Yeah.
Yes.
But it does always make me wonder how people get into sort of the hobbies, or well, I guess for some people it's not always a hobby, but I think, just with food in general, it's an interesting thing. I like cooking and stuff too. So I'm curious how you got into going so far as making your own mayonnaise.
It's very easy. It literally takes less than 5 minutes to make.
Okay.
Yes, it's really how it started. I'm not really sure how it started, but I'm a health nut. And I'm very much into nutrition and health and gut health and brain health. And usually when I have discussions with people about these topics, almost every single time someone asks me if I'm a nutritionist or if I'm a nurse. And then when I tell them that I work in web development, the last reaction I got was, how is that related? And I'm like, it's not. It's just something I have a hobby. I read a lot of books about these topics. The more you learn about what's good for you and what's not good for you, and I try to look for healthy substitutes for things that I've been eating my entire life. I've stopped eating most sugar. I used to be an addict. I used to be a chocolate addict. I could not possibly go a single day without eating chocolate. Now I rarely have any chocolate. I just don't feel like I need to have chocolate anymore. Once you start to balance the sugar in your blood, everything changes. And with mayonnaise, it was mainly because of the oils used in the mayonnaise that they make. And also, there was some things related. This is actually really ridiculous. It's because of weight gain and stuff like that. But it was mainly the healthy part. And I looked up the recipe. My mother always made mayonnaise at home, but I never really asked her how she did it. And eventually I asked her. She said it's just, eggs and some oil. I ended up changing the oil that I used and, a few like mustard and stuff like that. So I decided to give it a try. I used to not like making mayonnaise before because the way my parents used to make it is they would have this blender, you would have the eggs and you add but the oil was added like a tiny bit at a time. They would literally stand on top of the blender and drops of oil. It would be just like a tiny line of oil. And that would take some time. And I always thought, it's not worth it. But then someone taught me that you don't really have to do it that way. If you have a hand blender, a good hand blender, just make sure that the container is the same size as the blender. So when you put the blender inside the container, there's not a lot of space between the blender and the walls of the container. You just put all of the ingredients there, including the oil, all of it. That takes like 2 minutes. You just put the blender, turn it on, don't move it, and you're gonna start seeing the mayonnaise get thick, 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 and at some point it's just mayonnaise. And then you put it in the fridge, and it gets thicker, and it tastes. I'm drooling. It tastes so good. I love to add garlic to mine, and the secret ingredient is onions. So I have both garlics and onions in that. It tastes really, really good. I eat it with everything, with eggs and with meat and with. I love it. I haven't made some in a while, and the oil, I started making it with olive oil, so 100% natural, organic, and fresh. But olive oil has this, I don't know if pungent is the word for it. It has a very strong taste, and you can taste that, and that's what I didn't like about it. So I eventually started switching to avocado oil. Avocado oil is very light, and you can't taste the avocado oil. So what you end up tasting is just garlic and all the really nice spices that you've added to it. It's very easy, but I can't imagine myself making sourdough bread. I've never tried yet, so I should try.
It's definitely more involved. I wouldn't. I was doing, well, I still do like regular bread as well, just with like the yeast. I would say start there, because sourdough is definitely, it takes a while to get, it's multi-day process. So I will have to try and make my own mayo now, and I'll report back to let you know how it goes, because it does sound pretty easy.
Okay,
Yeah.
let me know if you need a recipe or something.
I will probably ask for one,
Okay.
yes. Is there any other sort of food or things that you enjoy making? I mean, you said you're into like nutrition and like just trying to eat healthy and everything, but is there something that like you look forward to making versus just you're trying just to be healthy?
Yes, well, it happens to be a very healthy meal, and it's also very easy to make. It's called fatte in Lebanese. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's the three main ingredients it's protein packed. So there's chickpeas, there's a meat of your choice. I usually use chicken, and yogurt. It could be Greek yogurt or regular yogurt. So that's protein, 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 and lots of fiber. With a yogurt, people are going to make it a little bit differently when it comes to what they include in it. For example, for me, it's just chicken. You make that chicken. I usually make it in the air fryer. I have the chickpeas ready. I just add the chicken on top of the chickpeas, and then I add the yogurt with some tahini and garlic. I add garlic to almost everything. I love garlic. And then you add some fried bread. I don't know if you're familiar with fattoush, which is the Lebanese salad where you add, it's technically the same bread, but I also make it a healthier version. I just spray some avocado oil and put it in an air fryer. Instead of deep frying the bread, I air fry it. This is my favorite meal of all time. It is packed with protein, easy to make, takes almost 30 minutes, with the time that you spend using the air fryer and stuff. That's my favorite meal. My favorite food used to be pizza. I still love pizza, but I don't eat it as much anymore because white flour gives me gut problems. White flour is not really healthy flour because they remove everything that's healthy and nutritious about the wheat. They take that away, and you're left with not that much nutrition anymore. So if I'm going to make pizza, I'm going to have to learn how to make bread and how to someday I'll try that.
Pizza dough is pretty straightforward. We cheat a lot at home where we'll just put like a pita bread or like anything like a wrap, something, and just stick it in the oven with pizza sauce. And my older son always gets mad at me. He's like, "Why didn't you make some dough?" And I'm like, "Because it takes a while. I don't have time today to make dough, but it is much better." But it's also.
Do you have a specific pizza specific or special pizza oven that you use, or do you use the?
I got like one of those, like a pizza stone thing, I think they're called, but you don't even need one. But it's just like a circle ceramic dish, so it goes on instead of a baking tray.
Okay. I think it's similar to what people use here to create bread.
Okay, yeah. So it just holds the heat well while it's sitting on it, and it's high temp, especially for pizza dough. It's just at a high temperature, but it works fine in the oven. I think it's better if you can get a really hot, like special thing for it, but you can
an
make
uni oven. I would love to get an uni. Have you heard of them? You know them, right?
Yeah.
I would love to get one. I recommended that to a friend once and he got it, and he said it's one of the best things that he has bought.
Nice. That's awesome.
If I'm going to make pizza, I'm definitely going to need an uni oven.
Yeah, you can do it without one.
Yeah, I know, but it's just anything to make the process more enjoyable.
Yes, yeah, I understand that. But yeah, I've taken a ton of your time, so I really, really appreciate everything. It was a blast chatting with you and learning about
Likewise.
everything that we talked about. So thank you very much. I'm going to put links for anybody who's listening. I'll put links to everything that we've talked about down in the description. And definitely, if you're interested in accessibility, make sure to check out Sarah's course, Practical Accessibility. Is there, in general, is there anywhere else people can follow you?
Yes, Blue Sky, Mastodon, currently on LinkedIn, and I never thought I would say this, but I'm actually liking it there. And then there's my newsletter. So all of the updates that I typically post. Basically, if you want to stay up to date with professional stuff, any new content, articles, podcasts, workshops, upcoming workshops, content. I don't like getting people to subscribe to my newsletter for discounts, but I do also share exclusive discounts for the course and future products in my newsletter. But if you're going to subscribe for the useful content. I post useful content there. I've actually just started posting regularly. I started last week and I'm planning on doing it regularly. I have an issue coming out hopefully next week. So yeah, newsletter, LinkedIn, Blue Sky, and Mastodon. I'm also available on X, but I'm not as active there anymore because the platform is not the same as it used to be before. I have 118,000 followers, I think, over there. And when I post something, it reaches only about 6,000 people. So the algorithm sucks. There's no more connection happening there. Community has mostly moved either to Mastodon or to Blue Sky. That's where most of us are hanging most of the time.
Awesome. So thank you very much once again. I really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And that's it for this week. As I mentioned, there's a whole bunch of links and descriptions down in the show notes, so go follow Sara, sign up for her newsletter, and all of that. And yeah, with that, I really hope that you enjoyed this as much as I had in chatting with her. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, don't forget to make your corner of the internet just a little bit more awesome.